So now we're going to switch gears and look at marine eukaryotes, specifically single-celled eukaryotes and fungi, and also marine plants. So we don't usually think about fungi, mushrooms, as being a marine organism, but there are certainly some types of fungi that can grow in the marine environment. Mycologists are the ones that study fungi. Fungi are, their niche is they are heterotrophic decomposers. So fungi cannot photosynthesize, they have to eat, and they do that by decomposing. They can also be parasitic with other organisms. Some of them can be pathogenic, so they can do harm. They can also have a symbiotic relationship with other organisms like algae. So this is lichen. You've probably seen lichen growing on trees. Depending on where you live, if you live someplace damp or someplace that has is kind of cool and damp, maybe the Pacific Northwest, then you see a lot of lichen. So that's a symbiosis between algae and fungi. So fungi reproduce actually by releasing spores. That's one of the ways that they get their gametes out there. And some of them in the marine environment can be facultatively marine. That means they can live in either marine or freshwater environments. They can survive both. So we'll keep looking, we'll look at more at these kind of mutualistic relationships, but algae and fungi are a really good example, making up lichen. Another type of marine microbes, so we looked at fungi, now we're going to look at single-celled eukaryotes like diatoms. So these are organisms you probably have never heard about before, but they're incredibly important, and they're actually really amazing too. When you look at them under a microscope, they look incredible. You think about, snowflakes always looking, they're all different from each other and unique. Kind of the same thing with diatoms. So each of these that you see in this picture are a single cell. So these are single-celled eukaryotic cells. They have a hard, glassy wall around them made of silica. So that silica shell is actually called a test. And we'll see that word come up again, test, just like taking an exam. And so the word test in this case is just referring to the hard shell that surrounds it and protects it. Diatoms are really important because they make up a huge amount of sediment. Basically, when these little guys die, these silica shells or tests fall to the bottom of the ocean and make up ooze. If it's made of silica, it's known as siliceous ooze, or maybe if it's specifically from diatoms, they call it diatomaceous ooze or diatomaceous earth. I've always thought that siliceous ooze would be a great name for a heavy metal band, so if you're looking to make a heavy metal band, that would be a good name. Another organism that's similar to diatoms are coccolithophores. The difference here is that these guys, they're photosynthetic. They are also made of a test of calcium carbonate, so different from the silica. This is calcium carbonate. So coccolithophores are basically, the cell is inside here, and it's like a hard little ball covered with, it looks like little poker chips. So that's the coccolithophore inside. These guys also, when they die, their tests fall to the bottom and make up ooze as well. This is called carbonaceous ooze. So if it comes from calcium carbonate, carbonaceous ooze. Another type, dinoflagellates. So these guys are also single-celled eukaryotes. These guys, actually, their test is made up of cellulose. So think about the consistency of your fingernails. That's sort of what this would feel like, the cellulose. And they can move with little flagella that stick out. So here's one under a microscope. You can kind of see its flagella here. This includes an organism called zooxanthellae, and these are a type of eukaryote that live inside of the tissues of coral. They have a symbiotic relationship with coral. And we'll see them again because they're actually super important. They do photosynthesis, and so they help coral to get food. And so if you've heard about chloral bleaching before, that's basically has to do with the zooxanthellae leaving the coral, abandoning the coral. Some dinoflagellates can also be pretty harmful. If you've ever heard of the phenomenon called red tide, you may not hear of it much where you live, but in the Gulf of Mexico here, it happens a lot. And it's basically when this organism becomes too numerous in the water, kind of like, remember we talked about eutrophication last week. Eutrophication is when, of course, the algae in the water become overabundant because there's too many nutrients and they just sort of explode in abundance. So these guys do the same thing, and it's called a harmful algal bloom. So it can be tough. They can release, these type of dinoflagellates can release a toxin that is what kills off fish and other marine organisms. So that's kind of a summary of the single-celled guys. What you need to know about them, basically just knows the distinctions between them, between the three types in particular, the diatoms, the coccolithophores, the dinoflagellates, because that's going to be pretty important when we look at sediment and when we look at larger organisms as well, like coral. So now we'll look at the multicellular primary producers. So this is going to be algae and plants. Something that's really important here to distinguish. Algae is not a plant. Algae is a distinctive type of organism, and we're going to look at how they are different than plants. Multicellular algae, so that's seaweed, for example. Seaweed is not vascular, meaning it does not contain roots, it does not contain veins that run up through the plant and deliver nutrients. They are not a plant. So that's an important distinction to make. Algae have a body called a thallus, so that's going to be the bulk of the body. And inside the thallus, there are often small pockets of air, little air bladders, which if you've ever held algae, let's say you're walking on the beach, and especially along the California coast, you pick up some algae. Sometimes it's kind of slimy, and you can feel these little pockets of air bladders in them. They use that to help them kind of the little air pockets help them float a little bit, but also so they stay upright in the water column. So those little air pockets will help keep them upright. Now, it may look like they have roots, like these. Here's a collection of some calcareous green algae here. And you look at it and you say, well, those look like roots. And you said they don't have roots, Miss Michael. They have what are called holdfasts. So think of it like an anchor or like a suction cup that holds them onto the sediment. That is different from roots, because roots not only they do that job of holding a plant into the sediment, but the most important thing that roots do is they're vascular, meaning they draw water up through them. So water is drawn up through the roots and nutrients are drawn up through the roots. Algae do not do that. So the holdfasts do not transport nutrients. All they do is hold them. They anchor them down to the bottom. They also have a variety of photosynthetic pigments. So that's chlorophylls, basically every type of chlorophyll. And we'll see that some of them, they're categorized. Some of them have different chlorophylls than others. Green algae is the first category of algae. Now, here's what's amazing is that green algae are actually considered to be part of the plant kingdom, even though they're not technically plants. So they belong in kingdom Plantae. They're in a phylum Chlorophyta. So chloro refers to the greenness of them, like chloroplasts. And that would include things like sea lettuce, like this guy right here. So green algae looks kind of green, but don't be fooled, because these different categories of algae, they might be color designated, green, red, and we're going to see brown, but that doesn't mean that the algae always appears green, red, or brown in those categories. So it can be a little confusing. Red algae is also in its separate kingdom. It's in kingdom Protista, Protists. These contain different chlorophylls than green algae. They both contain chlorophyll A, but red algae contains chlorophyll D, so that's what gives it its color. And then also the phytoclarathins. These are also little pigments that give it red color. So this is some examples of red algae, and here it could be kind of reddish or brown. It's kind of hard to discern, but these are both red algae here. And the red algae is pretty common as well. You'll find it anywhere you find green algae. The last type is brown algae. This is kingdom Chromista, so this is also in a separate kingdom, and also has chlorophyll A, but instead also has chlorophyll C, and a different type of pigment that gives it its brown color. So fucoxanthin gives it its brown color. This includes kelp and sargassum and rockweed. So here's some giant kelp that you see here, and a little bit of rockweed here in this picture. And so those are both types of brown algae. So just know the three types, know that they are in three separate kingdoms and that their chlorophylls differ. That's kind of the important thing. So some algae are calcareous, meaning they have a hard structure underneath, and some of them can have a rigid structure, making them look a lot like coral. So I'm going to go back up to these right here. These are calcareous hard algae. This here is seagrass, so this actually should be on the next page, but somehow this photo got moved. So we're going to look at seagrass in a minute. This is actually a plant, not an algae. So in this category, we're now moving on to seagrasses. These are marine flowering plants. So these are plants that have vascular tissue. So what often happens with seagrass and grass on land, like grass that makes up your backyard, there's not only roots, but there's this long tube-like structure called a rhizome that connects all of the individual stalks of the grass. So grasses are colonial, meaning that they're all connected by the rhizome, and then their individual roots branch down into the sediment. So seagrasses are what are called hydrophytes, meaning they have this long root system with the rhizome, and they also live below the water. So hydrophytes must live underneath the water. If they're exposed for too long in the sunlight, like when the tide goes out, they tend to not do very well. They're also important food for a lot of marine organisms. Manatees in particular love to graze on seagrasses. They provide a home for a lot of other organisms as well. Seagrasses are also obligate halophytes. So if you remember this term from last week, halophyte means they are salt lovers. So you cannot transplant a seagrass into fresh water and expect it to live. They need to be in salt water. So just like plants on land, they reproduce sexually. There's flowers basically that bloom. They're not going to look like flowers you're expecting to see on land, but they do indeed flower, and pollination occurs the same way. They undergo vegetative growth, so that's the part of their reproductive system that's asexual, so they grow upwards or down into the sediment when their roots grow. There's a lot of threats to seagrass habitats as well. Runoff and eutrophication tends to decrease the water quality, so it makes the water a lot murkier and light can't get down to the seagrasses, so that can kill them off. Construction and dredging. Dredging is where artificial channels are put in so that boats can make it in and out of an area that's otherwise very shallow. And what's awful is that they can be scarred pretty easily by excessive boating. And so if a boat with a propeller runs over seagrass and cuts it up, it can take between 7 to 10 years for that seagrass to grow back. And the reason for that is that if you were to imagine digging a ditch, digging a trench, you're digging downward into the sediment. So when a boat with a propeller runs through some seagrass, it's basically digging this trench with a propeller. Well, seagrasses will not grow downward away from light. They just won't. They basically have cells that are drawn towards light, and so they always move in the direction of light. And that's a survival advantage. But what that means is that they're not going to grow down into that trench and replace the seagrass that was cut away. So here's some examples from the air of what it looks like. So this is an area that's zoned off here. That's a propeller scar where a boat ran through, and there's seagrass on both sides. Here's what it looks like as well in very shallow water. And this is a pretty intense photo. This is actually taken close to where I live here. And you can see this is a big shoal underwater. So a shoal is like a big sandbar, but most of the time it has seagrass growing on it. And it's very shallow, and people are out boating, and they don't know how shallow the water is underneath them, and oftentimes they run over it. So all of these little scars here are propeller scars from seagrass. So, and here you can see them here where somebody tried to cut the corner coming into this channel, and a lot of times. So it can be pretty intense. So that's, we're going to actually pause here, and I'm going to do mangroves in the next video so that we have plenty of time to talk about them as well.